China is moving forward with reform plans designed to build a stronger, modern military. The recently announced reforms include the formation of China's Rocket Force and Strategic Support Force. For more on the reform plan and the upgrading of the People's Liberation Army, we begin with this report from CCTV's Han Bin in Beijing.
A big rise in the status of China's Second Artillery Force, the PLA's Strategic Deterrent Force. It's been officially renamed as China's Rocket Force, making the PLA a joint forces with the Land, Navy and the Air Force. In addition, the Strategic Support Force has been formed to highlight the importance of electronics and space in military strategies.
The formation of the Rocket Force and the Strategic Support Force is a major decision made by the Central Military Commission to realize the dreams of a strong army. It's also a crucial measure in rebuilding a modern force.
The newly established forces are only part of the ongoing reforms the army is undertaking. The Central Military Commission released a key statement revealing the direction of the process and stressing their determination to achieve the reforms. The key message is the strengthening of the army leadership and the move away from its decades-old land-centric system towards a joint command system that will upgrade the army's overall capabilities.
The reform statement clarifies why there's a need to reform, what to reform, how to reform. It makes clear requirements for the army and will play a supporting role.
Guidelines for China's military reform plans were announced in November as President Xi Jinping vowed a breakthrough in the overhaul by 2020. President Xi's statement indicates that the current 7 military command regions will be transformed into several combat areas to better coordinate joint operational strength. China has decided to cut 300,000 troops, which will leave 2 million personnel in the army. China wants to build a modern military system that can potentially win an information-based war. Many believe the reform of the military is a major task for the leadership. It will deeply transform the army and the country's security landscape.
Well, it's been decades since the Chinese armed forces have faced an actual military conflict. But the army believes the best way to avoid it is by having the capabilities to deter it. The PLA is undergoing a deep transformation and focusing more on quality. The direction is clearer now, but the true value of the restructuring may take some time to quantify.
Han Bin, CCTV, Beijing.
Joining me now from Beijing is Chue Hui. He is a Deputy Commandant of the College of Defense Studies at the National Defense University of China, and he served in the Chinese Army and Navy. Welcome to the show, sir. Professor, last November, China announced a plan and guidelines to reform the armed forces by 2020. That's, of course, an effort to build a strong and modernized army with Chinese characteristics. Could you guide us through the key steps of the military reform?
Okay, the overall military and national defense reform has already started since last year. And we can say, generally speaking, there are 4 steps and 4 levels of reform also. The first step and first level is to have a new leadership and commanding systems which can keep the pace with the times and make this military more capable. And the second level is about restructuring and recompensation of the military. And the third level is for the policy change and reforms for personnel policy and logistic and financial policies of the military. And the fourth level we call it civil military integration development. Up to now, the first level has been done, and all of the positions of the CMC have been filled, and the 5 armed command has been established, and also the different services has been also, the leadership has been made. And now we are going to, enter into the second level and the second step. That is the restructuring of the forces and recompensation of the forces. At the same time, we will start the policy change and the civil military integration development.
Right, now part of this overhaul plan is to cut troop levels by something like 300,000. Will that be difficult to achieve? How soon do you see it being done? And what are some of the major challenges in accomplishing that?
Oh yes, for a number of 300,000 troops reduction is a daunting force. It's no easy job for any military, and it will take a longer time. But we're determined to implement this kind of reform by the end of 2017. Yes, absolutely, it will have a lot of difficulties. Number one difficulty is, I think, coming from the people's mindset, and also, it will touch upon the people's the personal interest. For instance, some of the military officers will be, transformed from military to the civilians, and the families will be moved to other places. And some of the forces also will be redeployed, and some new elements will be created. So it's a very complicated issue. It will spend a lot of efforts. But up to now, I think, from the people's mindset level, we have unified, understandings of that and determined to taken all of the difficulties. I'm sure that by the year of 2017, it will be done. But it will have further jobs need to be done to make fully implementation of the reform program up to 2020.
Now, China has said that there will be no changes to its national defense policy or its military strategy. Why is China engaging in military reform at this time?
It's a very interesting question. So what I want to say is that we say no fundamental change of the national defense policy doesn't mean that we cannot have military reform. And while we have military reforms, if it doesn't mean that we will fundamentally change our national defense policy. That's the logic. And as to the Chinese national defense policy, since the founding of PRC, this overall national defense policy has never been changed. We call it active defense. That means we'll never attack unless we are attacked. And we'll certainly counterattack if we were attacked. For that, we say we have never changed. But there are some kind of changes. For that, for instance, the capability of fighting and deterring wars and addressing a variety of challenges will be improved, and Chinese military will be more ready to take more contributions, to make more contributions to regional and world peace, will provide more public security good for regional and global securities. And Chinese military will be more confident and more ready to engage with other militaries for cooperation in dealing with the common threats we are faced. Yeah.
What are the messages do you think other countries will be receiving from this ongoing reform program that's been adopted by the Chinese?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think different people perceive the same thing differently. I think according to my knowledge, I think majority of the countries in the global community, I think we have more than 200 countries, majority of them, I think they perceive this kind of military reform of China positively, and they think this is a natural development with the overall strength of the country, and they have a very high expectation of China to taking more, contributions to regional peace keeping and to cooperation with other countries. But however, there are some other countries, but I have to say very small number of countries, in the region which have a territory disputes with China, and some major powers who have a kind of, different, security concept. They might perceive these rounds of reform differently.
Now, just to get back to a point you made just now, China is not a traditional military power like the United States or like Russia. As you pointed out, the key objective of the Chinese army is national security. But given China's major economic power status right now, do you think China will assume more responsibilities in international peacekeeping operations, for example, with this modernized army?
I think my answer to you is positive. As we know that China's military is, generally speaking, is a, inward-looking military. His main task is to defend his territory and sovereignty and maintain regional peace and security to create a good environment for his people's livings here. And we have very few experiences to do operations overseas. And the biggest differences between Chinese military and American military and the Russian military is that for the past 3 or 4 decades, Chinese military has no shooting, have never shot a single bullet. So we really don't have a kind of experience, but that doesn't mean Chinese military will take less responsibilities. Actually, since the 1990s, Chinese military engaged in peacekeeping, and just within a couple of years, China has made the greatest contribution for personnel in peacekeeping among the P5 countries, and also contribute more than most of the countries in engineering and healthcare and something else in terms of peacekeeping under the authorization of the UN authorities. And the Chinese military is determined to contribute more in that regards in the future.
Professor Xu Hui, thank you very much for joining us, sir. We are going to take a short break right now. More on the significance of China's military reforms when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to the show, and joining me now from Vienna is Victor Gao. He is director of the China National Association of International Studies. Also with me here in the studio is Saurabh Gupta. He is a senior fellow at the Institute of China-America Studies. Welcome to both of you to the show. Victor, let me start with you. President Xi Jinping has called these reforms a milestone in the modernization of the Chinese military. He said that the formation of the Rocket Force and the Strategic Support Force are crucial measures to rebuilding a modern force. Question is, how important will these reforms be to China's security?
I would say the military reform that China is going through as we speak is the largest scale and the most profound military reform since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. And the implications will go very, very far. And the whole military is being shaked up as we speak. And the Chinese military forces will be completely remolded as a result of this military reform. And it will impact on all the branches of the military, as well as the lineup of the military command system. So this will be unprecedented and extremely important. The Chinese military will emerge out of this military reform completely remolded and reproduced.
So what is your assessment of these reforms? How will they be viewed by the international community?
The international community will keep a close watch on these reforms, but these are mostly reforms of an organizational and institutional nature which are internal to the Chinese military. So this will be primarily something that the experts in the West will be watching in terms of how China goes about its modernization and whether it is successful in making these reforms. It is not going to be seen as necessarily a threat as such. That would be determined more by the force structure and the nature of deployments, etc. But there will be a great watch on this simply because this really will make the Chinese military a very robust fighting force in the Asia Pacific and well beyond.
Victor, looking at these reforms which are being implemented right now, the modernization of the military, were they inevitable in any case for China?
Well, it's not only the modernization of the military in China. I would say prior to this reform, the Chinese military lineup was mostly for national defense within the country, and the whole of the country was divided into 7 military commands. And these military commands very much followed the administrative lineup, the provinces, the regions, etc. And their top mission was to hold the ground in case a war breaks out and defend to the last minute. And then between the military commands, coordination will be minimum. And further, I would say, at the very top level, the Central Military Commission was more symbolic rather than substantive, because the real power in the military lineup was very, very much vested in the four general departments: the General Political Department, the General Staff, the General Logistics Department, and the General Equipment Department. Each of these four general departments would be considered like a huge mountain in itself, and most of the decisions will be made in each of these departments. The Central Military Command stayed on top of that, but it really remained more symbolic than substance. After the reform, 3 of the general departments will be abolished and folded into the Central Military Commission, and the Central Military Commission would become more substantive rather than symbolic. And also you mentioned the renaming of the missile force, for example. Originally it was called the 2nd Artillery Force, and also the Strategic Support Troop, which would be very much modernized, using all kinds of new ways of thinking, including cyberspace, for example, as well as financial, energy security, etc. All these things will be folded into this newly created new army. And I would say, and on top of that, the creation of the 5 theaters, as we call it, would really be facilitating the Chinese military force to project their strengths, not only within the Chinese border, but far beyond the Chinese border in the coming years and decades. In that sense, the Chinese military will not only be streamlined and modernized, but also it will be enabled to fight a war not only within China, but beyond its border in the coming few years. Of course, the fundamental rationale for the Chinese military force remains unchanged. That is national defense. But now that Chinese interests go everywhere in all corners of the world, the Chinese military need to go through this remolding very quickly, so that in case of any conflict or any major threat to Chinese national interest, the Chinese military force can behave as it is needed in a new and remolded manner.
Right, and Saurabh, looking at that, China's armed forces have not been engaged in any kind of armed conflict for decades. Will these reform plans that are underway right now make it easier for the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, to deter war?
To deter war? Oh, absolutely. It'll definitely will help the Chinese military and the People's Liberation Army to deter war, because we are seeing the creation of a full spectrum capability, full spectrum dominance capability across the Chinese military, which will become a very potent force. That itself will be a deterrent to any actor, and we're not talking mid-sized actors, we're talking somebody as powerful as the United States. We are also seeing in the course of this reform, this focus on informational jointness across various domains, which is very important, because that will go to the heart of a Chinese military which can deter or can take action very rapidly in terms of at a time of a contingency. This is true modernization of a military from a defensive force to an offensive fighting force if need be in any geographic theater. But also at the end of the day, this is not about China going far out to find enemies to fight.
Right.
It's more about taking care of its interests and defending its interests as they expand, as China's footprint expands in the world.
Right, talking about China's expanding footprint, Victor, China and the East African state of Djibouti have agreed to establish what they call a logistical support facility in Djibouti. Now, what are the unique challenges that China faces right now? I mean, it's a growing economic power. It has strategic international commitments as well. Can we expect more of a focus on the sea right now, for instance?
Well, ever since December 2008, China has been rotating a flotilla, each flotilla serving for 3 months in the water areas of Somalia, mostly to protect the merchant shipping lane over there. China, after all, is the largest trading nation in the world and is the largest manufacturing nation in the world, and Chinese economic and political interests really penetrate to all corners of the world. And each time when the flotilla, normally including 2 warships and the support ship, would be navigating in that particular international water off Somalia, there was no particular support system to support these 3 ships. And therefore, I would say the Chinese commitment to build presence in Djibouti will provide necessary support for the flotilla to provide protection not only to Chinese merchant ships, but also to merchant ships for all other countries. And I would say the Djibouti military presence for China will just be the first of quite a number of them which are being contemplated. Eventually, I would say, China will have military presence not only in Djibouti, but in several other well-chosen regions in the world to provide strategic support for the Chinese military presence in the Indian Ocean and possibly also in the Atlantic Ocean, and also here where we are very closely following in the Pacific Ocean. So I would say the essence of Chinese national security is expanding, and the ingredients of the national security are being reshuffled as we speak going forward.
Victor, just one other point I want to ask you about that. And can we expect a reaction from other forces in the region? I mean, will other countries start ramping up as well?
Well, China is one of the 5 permanent member states of the United Nations Security Council, and China, up to this Djibouti endeavor, is the only country which does not have overseas military presence. In China, we used to take great pride in saying that we do not have any single Chinese soldier stationed abroad unless they are joining the United Nations peacekeeping forces. But going forward, I would say this will change, mainly because China needs a military presence in other parts of the world to provide speedy and effective military protection for the Chinese national interests. I hope other countries will believe that the Chinese military presence eventually spreading out to other parts of the world will still be very much used for protecting the Chinese national interests, rather than to look for conflicts or confrontation with other countries. And in a sense, I would say the more Chinese presence in the world to be fully protected, the better it will facilitate global peace and stability. So in this sense, I would say there will be a symbolism, but also substantive change in the Chinese military deployment strategies going forward. And other countries need to readjust to this very fast and large-scale change in the Chinese military presence.
What do you feel, Sarab? Will other countries, other forces in the region respond as well?
Yes, they will respond in the context of China going out, not so much in the context of institutional and organizational reform within the military, but in terms of its actual deployments far from its shores. In this area, what I would suggest, I mean, as Victor says, this is a natural corollary of China being who it is in terms as a global trading power and its wider interests. And China needs to have these deployments overseas and presence like at Djibouti. What I would suggest, though, is that China's military diplomacy also needs to be enhanced and improved, and actually should be in a position prior to these deployments communicate intent across the sea lines of communication to the important countries that reside along these sea lines of communication as to the reasons it is doing these particular deployments. I think Chinese military diplomacy has not been as good as its foreign policy diplomacy, and it has not communicated as well as what its intentions are at times. And this, given that China is this enormous power and it's going to be the biggest economy in the world, etc., pretty soon, it creates a certain degree of apprehension because one does not understand, one is always a little fearful what these capabilities might be used for at a later point of time once they become more entrenched.
Right. Victor, what is your view on that? Should China be making its intentions more clear? Should it be telegraphing its intentions to ease the kind of apprehensions that Saurabh's been talking about?
Well, definitely, I think China needs to do a much better job going forward in making its intentions and strategies better known and understood by other countries. On the other hand, it's also important to emphasize that the world we are living in today is also very, very different. You know, mankind is faced with threats from terrorism, from extremism, and many other non-traditional forces, unconventional forces, and I think mankind probably would need, a stronger China, a China which is ready to be fully engaged with many other parts of the world to play a more constructive role, including projecting its military presence. I would say in fighting against piracy, for example, as well as in fighting against terrorism, as well as keeping peace under the United Nations banner, for example. China can do a lot of things going forward, but China really need to make itself better known and also try to reduce any kind of miscomprehension or a misunderstanding on the parts of other major powers in the world. And further, I would say, the United States for many years has been accusing China of being a free rider and is pointing out to the dilemma that on the one hand, major countries in the world need China to be more readily engaged in dealing with these international crises, but on the other hand, they want China to make its position better known and more transparent to the other major powers in the world. Therefore, I think communication, dialogue, and making China's position better known to the other countries will be absolutely necessary going forward in the coming years. However, I would say that a world where China is ready to be fully engaged with will be a better world because China will be ready to make its resources available to join other major powers in the world whenever crises happen, whenever confrontations happen in other parts of the world. And when there was a major evacuation effort needed in Yemen, for example, the Chinese naval ships actually evacuated not only Chinese nationals from Yemen, but also about nationals from about a dozen countries from Yemen. And I would say this will continue and be repeated going forward when the Chinese military will have a chance to serve the international community by making its resources and capabilities available.
Okay, Victor Gao in Vienna, Saurabh Gupta here with me in the studio. Thanks to both of you for joining us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And we'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page. That's at CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.